start over. Dr. Shirley Madison is Interim Vice Provost of Outreach and Engagement and faculty in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction. Previously, she served as the Associate Dean for Research and for Staff and for Faculty Development for the College of Education. She was a classroom teacher for 27 years. She's a member of the Teaching Academy now. Her research interests go to representing math, teaching and thinking structures in K-12 settings. And she has a long history of deep involvement with community engaged scholarship projects. More recently, she's focused on improving the research skills of grad students. She's the recipient of many grants and awards, including the Chancellor's Council Distinguished Teaching Award for both her outstanding teaching and her contributions related to excellence in teaching. She's a sought-after mentor. Many of us have benefited from her deep knowledge of the do's and don'ts of grant applications. And that's how I knew of her. Her reputation preceded her. I was on a grant team, and we're like, are we getting this right? Have we got all of our I's dotted and T's crossed? And I was told, you need to talk to Shirley. We have as well today co-presenting Dr. Cassidy Street, who has, she tells me, benefited a great deal from Dr. Madison's mentoring as well. Dr. Street is currently the director for the Human Research Protection Program, and she is the most Kasner Texas Tech person you will ever meet. Triple degrees from Texas Tech in agricultural communications. Her research areas are in higher ed, student retention and recruitment. Prior to joining the office of the Vice President for Research, she was coordinator for student retention in Kasner. Now she serves as the direct liaison to the IRB chair and associate chair. Her job is to assist Texas Tech researchers with constructing and submitting IRBs to gain approval to conduct human subjects research. Welcome to you both. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Brian. So I'm just curious, how many of you have ever sat down and had a conversation with Dr. Street? Oh, good. That's good, because I'm going to tell you that a lot of people have this impression about the IRB board, that they're kind of unapproachable and that they're there to throw up things so that you can't do your research, etc. What Brian failed to tell you is at one point in time, I was actually on the IRB review board as a reviewer. And so I came into a lot of things, having looked at it from a totally different frame of perspective at that point in time. So one of the things that we are going to talk about is we're going to kind of go through some slides here, making sure that I can find a little arrow. There we go. So let's just talk about community for a second, and I hope that these guys aren't offended, but I am going to minimize them. Sorry. It's just so it's going to be, and no, it's not Brian talking, it's me. Okay. So community, in our field, we consider it's external to the campus. Okay. I understand that there's going to be communities within the campus, but it's external. We like to think that they're geographically, there's a proximity to there, but I have to say that we're also, as we expand to international, that may be a very wide range of our community partners, and they do share common characteristics. And the partnerships then are sustained collaborations. Okay, please notice that this is two words, sustained, which means it's going to be a long period of time, which if you're a tenure track faculty member may be causing you some angst with your annual reviews. And then it's a collaboration. Okay, and we try to collaborate between those people in higher education and the communities. Why? For the mutual beneficial exchange, exploration, and application of knowledge, information, and resources. So there's going to be, and by the way, we don't always do all of those at the same time, but there is supposed to be this exchange. So here's the other thing that you really need to understand. When I talk about community partnerships, I put them on equal footing with me. And in some cases, they actually have a better understanding of where I need to go than I do when I'm first going ahead and working with these partnerships. So if you're one of those people that's a traditional person, it's pretty much you come in, you're going to do the research that I direct. When we do outreach and engaged research, we're doing the type of work that they are directing us to do. So there's a big difference with that. And that does cause some angst with that. So it's an engaged scholarship, it's a collaborative and reciprocal partnership. We will both learn from this. We're going to have a mutual beneficial exchange of knowledge and resources. It's a two-way relationship. Sometimes it actually grows to be more than two ways. They'll bring in another partner, bring in another partner, and it becomes a big thing. I just experienced that with trying to push out a grant, and it just grew and it grew and it grew. What you're trying to do is taking the community that doesn't really have the resources to do a lot of these scholarly activities. They may not have the ability to write a survey and really convey that. They might be able to send that survey out like crazy, but they couldn't write one that would get to the heart of the matter in the first place. That's the reason why you're there. That's the reason why you're going ahead and engaging with them, because you're bringing a level of skills and knowledge that there's a gap in their area, and they're giving you access to people. In some cases, it's a gap for your area. So it's very mutually beneficial. So broadly defined, engaged scholarship is scholarly work that is conducted for, in, and with the community or the general public. Okay, and by the way, those definitions are on our website. So it's unique. When we talk about engaged scholarship, we can do a lot of different collaborations. Okay, and a lot of people think it all has to be research. When I'm talking about engaged scholarship, we may actually be doing scholarship off of teaching or scholarship off of service activities. However, we're going to be systematic in order to have it research, and that would be a definition that Dr. Street would say. It's got to be systematic. It's also going to have to involve human subjects, okay? And we could talk about some pitfalls of things about data that has come from human subjects that maybe has not been ethically collected or distributed or stored, etc. Okay, so that requires us to have clear agreements. Okay, clear agreements between the membership composition. You may find that you're kind of going, I don't know why this person needs to be on there. A lot of times people outside of academic areas are kind of going, why is this person here? Those ideas have to be communicated. We need to talk about data ownership. Who really owns this at different points in time? Is it collaborative, cooperative? How are we going to actually use the data? I'm sure that we've all been cautioned about, you're collecting data. Are you using it in the way that you said that you were going to use it? Okay. And then disseminating. These are things that you really need to talk about in your research partnerships. And by the way, I would say that those would happen in a non-engaged scholarship area too. If you were just having an NSF grant with somebody else, you would want to have that type of information. However, it becomes a little trickier working with partners because we have to make sure that they understand the terminology that we're really asking for. There's got to be accountability in the research process from the very initial going ahead and recruiting, even conceptualizing, and it needs to be mutually beneficial, that beneficence that they always talk about in your city training. They're kind of going with that. A lot of these agreements can be informal, but a lot of times we're going to have to do something a little bit more formal. So memorandums of agreement, data sharing and authorship arrangements, clear job descriptions. One of the things that you might find is that you might actually need to go ahead and talk about individuals that how are they going to go ahead and involve like information technology here if you're going to be grabbing things. So you might have to have a larger group than you really thought. It's a very unique situation, but there are some really great benefits for both groups. So here's a few things that I just really want to kind of iterate. And I've known Dr. Street when she was a graduate student in my methods class. So we've had a long, rich description, and she understands that I was teaching research ethics right then, you know, right away from the very get-go. But one of the things that I will tell you is no matter what, and it's for any project, I like to consult the IRB early. I like to go to her and say, here's kind of an outline, give her kind of a heads up, possible some timelines, have some discussions about some things. And here's the reason why, especially if you're doing like grant work, you're going to have this well in place, because if it's ever awarded, the IRB has to be in place before they'll give you funds. So if you're working too late, it's not going to happen. If you're doing a grant, for example, the federal government may want to see that there's assurances already in place. But the other thing is that in developing a partnership, you're going to have to do a lot of negotiation back and forth. You're going to have to do a lot of explaining back and forth. And sometimes they're going to ask a question that you're going to need to go to the IRB board and get some clarification on. So start those partnerships early. So even as you're developing your partnerships, start having that conversation with the HRPP office about IRBs. A couple of things that you may not be aware of that I just kind of want to emphasize. Partners will also need IRB training if involved in the research process. If you've been lately on the website, you know that as of January 1st, a lot of things kicked in, including city training. Now, I have to say that I came in with city training, and I've had city training in at least 3 different institutions and have to have proof for all of that. But one of the things that's also happened is outside external people that are involved in this process also need city training. Now, that could be a little bit of a headache, and we've negotiated some things at different points in time, but especially they're usually involved in recruitment and consent more than anything else.
And
Okay,
collection of data.
collection of data will be the other thing. So you're going to need to think about that, and you have to kind of think about that ahead of time while you're developing that. Like, if this is a long-term project, which most outreach engaged projects are long-term, you may have to retrain because it's over the 2 or 3 year period. You might have to continue to add people, subtract people from this. So you need to know this like right away. Okay. And this is where having conversations with Dr. Street and that group is really, really important, because you might be sitting there going, oh my gosh, that could be like 50 people. Yeah, I have a project where we were actually estimating it was going to be in the hundreds. Okay, you've got to have this conversation early. Partners need a clear understanding of key research terms and processes. We're not great in academic areas to kind of give that middle school idea of what's that communication. You know, a lot of you, there was a time frame where, as an IRB reviewer, I had to go ahead and see if the Lexile reading level was at 8th grade or lower. You know, I mean, seriously, we had to screen for those things. Well, that's the type of thing that I'm meaning here. Clear understanding of the terms, and then also of the processes. Because in education, for example, we think we know what teaching is. Well, we also think what everybody does is a survey, or other terms that we use. They need to be really, really clear. You need to be clear. The partners need to be clear, because they're going to be the first lines for the participants to come back to and talk to you. You need to be transparent as to who and exactly and what is exactly being studied. Okay, none of this deception type stuff in this area. This is probably one of those cases where I would say deception should not be a common part of your research for community engaged research. Okay, and there are uses for deception in research, but I would say that that is very problematic with a community partner. Okay.
It wouldn't be sustainable.
Yes. And then you have to consider the uniqueness of the partner's culture, some of the issues that they might face with, let's say, technology and connectivity. You want them to take this survey, and you wanted it to be anonymous, so you were going to send it out electronically. But can they read it, or is the device that they're looking at something where they can read it and maybe change it to a different language? Have you planned for a different language? All of those other things. So, and I would say that if this is not your priority, it certainly will be the IRB boards. Their priority is to protect the participants. Okay, if you go in with that attitude when you're talking with your community partners, that we're here to help, we're here to learn and help you help other people, then I think this shouldn't be a problem. But I'm just going to say that if that's the sticky part, it's because you're not thinking about putting yourself into those situations with individuals. And by the way, I would also say that in your community engaged projects, it's come to light in the last couple of weeks or so that I've been thinking, you know, what was really great when we set this up at the beginning of an IRB, I think at some point in time, we need to reflect on that IRB and say, are we able to protect this group of participants now, given the climate, maybe politically or socially or in the world? Think about all the things that had to happen in COVID that we had to go back and redo. And a lot of times we just say, oh, we've got the IRB, we're done. Sometimes I think we need to go back and have that self-check and say, is this still good as we're moving through the project? Is this still appropriate? Go ahead and modify it as needed at that point in time. And a lot of times, like I said, it's just one and done, and we forget. So partners and researchers need to be clear on who owns the data and how data would be used. This is kind of a repetition of things, but this is one of the things that I think is important that you keep reminding yourself about. Who owns the data? That could be problematic. And by the way, I would also say, because I have my colleague here, Joshua, from the library, you also need to think about how you're storing said data. Okay, and there are ways for the library to help you and assist you with that. If you're working with some grants, you might really need to bring them in so that it's accessible to your partner and it's accessible to you, and it protects your participants. Okay, so sometimes it's co-ownership of that data, but they still need to understand that just because they have that data, they can't just use it for whatever they want to. I mean, you stated that people thought that you were collecting it for this purpose. You need to really, hold yourself to that. You need to be creative in addressing implementation of the various phases of the study. This is again where reaching out to Dr. Street, having these conversations. Things may be going really well, and you get to phase 3 and you realize, oops, I need to make some changes. Again, this should be a living document in a lot of ways, an agreement between you and your partner, but also think about making the additional changes to the IRB itself. And then partners and researchers have to be diligent when transferring data. Some of the things that we just kind of forget is you lose your phone and you just go down to the store and you get a new one. Well, what was on your phone? All your passwords, but what was on the phone maybe for data? You have a laptop. Okay, Dr. Street is getting a new setup today. How is she going to how are they going to protect the transfer of any data that would go back and forth between things? We don't think about these things because, it used to be, we thought better about it because we had to have computers last 8 to 10 years. Nowadays, we're switching devices all the time. We need to make sure that everything is protected on that. Securing identifiable information, some things you just have to have, like consent forms, but is there a way that maybe you could scan said consent forms, make sure that you destroy the written property for that and put them in a locked file so that it's not as easily accessible? And there are ways to do that, but you have to think about that ahead of time. And you also need to tell the IRB when that's going to happen. When is that going to occur? And then now, where is that information going to reside? How you're going to be referring to the project, the names and labels that we come up with some of these different ideas. There's lots of different things that you're going to need to be working through that. And then again, confidentiality and anonymity must be a priority in these situations. So what happens if you actually finally go ahead and finish your study and you have things to present? Well, hopefully you've already negotiated that both partners and researchers are credited on any products. Now, it could be that you really have no vested interest in that infographic that you created. Okay, that brochure, that's not something that you really want, but you're going to need it for your own promotion and tenure packet. And yet, on the other hand, when you're submitting this, are you giving credit to your partner and saying, this was made possible through an agreement with XYZ? On the other hand, can you actually identify that group? Because maybe you can't. Again, these are things that you should pre-negotiate at different points in time. If you're presenting, do you want to bring along a community partner? In some settings, like the Engaged Scholarship Consortium, a lot of times we like to bring in the partnering group or a representation from that partnering group. In some cases, it may not be appropriate. Okay. These things really you have to think about ahead of time. You may have to be creative in presenting findings of the project to the community. And one of the big things that happens with that is you have a tendency to write it for the academic community. You have to be able to make sure that you can translate that. And this is where your community partner can just make sure that you use them quite a bit, because they'll say, oh, hey, for this group, they really enjoy the graphics. In this group, maybe we can go ahead and have a little more printed material. No matter which partners you're working with, you need to engage them in this idea about how you present findings of the project back to the community. And here's the other thing I would caution. Please present back to the community. They're your partners. You need to respect them. You need to go ahead and bring things back to them so that they understand what exactly happened. Otherwise, there's this mysterious mystique type thing that goes on where we're not quite sure how we partnered with this group. We never really saw any products. So make sure that you go ahead and actually do present back to the community. Again, it will be maybe different types of products or genres based on who the individuals are, but you still should go ahead and make that honest effort to take your project back to the community. Consider if information needs to be translated to another language. Okay. So if you've been working in a specific community and you've been writing and it's already been in English, but you realize that maybe you should do a couple of brochures and reports in another language or a couple of different languages, or make it accessible for visually impaired. You were doing an oral presentation, you need to make it better for a hard of hearing individual. These are things that you need to also do. Okay, and that's disseminating your data back into communities. And then any revisions, make sure that you don't just go ahead and do them without involving your partner. Okay, because they need to agree to the fact that they're going to be held to these same standards. Let's say you change how you're going to go ahead and collect information from the individual or recruit an individual. Well, you need to inform the partner, and the partner might say, oh, no, that won't work. Or maybe they'll say, well, have you thought about XYZ? So those are things that you really need to kind of consider. And I have a bunch of references here. So let me just kind of step back for a little bit and kind of tell you a little bit about a project that I've been involved with. It is a Promise Neighborhood grant. Now, the College of Education has had one in the past with a former dean. You might know it as East Lubbock Promise Neighborhood. We're ready to do phase 2 with that. And there are a lot of moving parts. Okay, there's the community members, there's the school district, there's the university groups. We're doing a needs assessment. That was an interesting thing. Was the needs assessment, did it need to go through the IRB? You know, all sorts of things, very short timelines, very short windows. I was juggling multiple things, working with the IRB, but also directing this and going through this. So you at some point in time, it may be helpful for you to develop a team or some sort of series of things that you're kind of keeping track of, all of the various steps that you're going through that. The grant funding for that was up to 30 million. So you can imagine the number of moving parts and moving pieces. And the fact that I'm working with community partners on various levels with various entities, nonprofits, the school district, if it's a different group, a medical group, whatever, you're kind of having all of these conversations. We're also targeting, since it's a neighborhood grant, we're targeting everything from infants to the older generation. Okay, so if you're collecting data, you're going to find out that when you're writing the IRB, you may actually be sitting there saying, this is for everybody who's early learners. And this is where we're going to get the elementary students. And this is where we're going to have the middle school students. And this is what we're going to do for the high school students. And this is what we're going to do for parents. This is what we're going to do. I mean, seriously, Dr. Street and I know that the number of consent forms was huge. And then they all had to be translated to Spanish.
I think you had like 18.
Yeah. Okay. And it depended upon what they were doing. Were they taking a survey, or were we interviewing them about something that they had experienced? Okay. Again, this is just to kind of show you what could happen. Now, that is a very large scale community project. Fortunately, I've had some experience with doing some of those things, and I could understand that. But it can grow on you to the point where it gets a little bit out of hand. And again, bringing her in really, really early really helped with that. So can I tell them a little bit how we decided to handle the recruiting and consent stuff? Because it's not a normal thing. So
And it hasn't been approved. That's on my only hesitation.
yeah. Okay. So we didn't get the grant, so we're not sure how this is going to play out. But literally, since we were going to be reaching roughly 25,000 individuals, you can imagine what the consent process would look like for that. And I came to her and said, I can't imagine that I would know at any point in time everybody who's doing consent or anybody who's collecting data or any of these things. So what are we going to do? Because I can't have this IRB perpetually being amended. Because the minute it starts being amended, what happens? You stop, right? Until you actually have approval to move forward. So we were thinking, and we don't know that this is really going to work, but we were actually thinking about going ahead and doing some very focused groups where all we really talked about was, you're going to be a group that's going to be interacting and doing the recruiting and consenting. And then we were thinking that we could go ahead and bring a group together just like this and say, this is a group, we're getting into Q3, okay? You're the group. Here's what Dr. Street is going to tell you about consenting and recruiting individuals. No coercion, no, don't say these things. Don't do these things. Have we had approval for that? No, but conceptually, it kind of makes sense to us. But we would have to have documentation that they attended. We would have to have a sign-in sheet that would say that this is the session that they stayed in, because that's a protection then for them coming back and forth. So we're still working out things. That's the thing I want you to really understand. In community engaged research, there's a lot of variables and moving pieces. And so you need to go ahead and really be working with your IRB board quite a bit to think about these problems and to bring them to them. Because when I first approached that with Dr. Street, she was kind of, oh, I mean, like deer in the headlight, like she totally understood, because for me to just even go through and say, oh, let me pick this name and this name and this name and this name and this name, and I didn't know. And I wouldn't necessarily know all of these individuals. So we're still working on some things, but that's a really great thing, is that now she's going to go to her head organization and say, what are some of the best practices that we can go ahead and use? Because we're pushing the envelope as we're involving individuals, and we need to be, okay? We need to be. So I'm going to stop with my part, and I'm going to let her go on with her part, but I've kind of set you up for a minute.
Yeah.
Do you want me to stay here, or do you want to do the little clicking?
It's up to you.
I'll let you go.
Okay, so a lot, Dr. Madison covered a lot of the topics that I want to stress to y'all as well, but I'm going to kind of tell you a little bit more from like an IRB side why we're concerned with that. I will also tell you, if you would go back to her slide that had unique question mark, I guarantee you that we have had research misconduct cases on every single one of those topics. It's who owns the data, who's the author, you didn't give me the right credit. It's, I don't want to say a weekly basis for Dr. Young, but every single one of those topics gets brought up. And so I just think it's so important to have that written documentation of what everybody's role is. Like Dr. Madison said, our goal is to protect the participants. So when you come to me and you say, Cassidy, you're making my life harder, I'm going to say, I'm so sorry. I'm not here to make your life easy. I'm here to protect the participants. And I'm always up for consultation, as Dr. Madison knows, Dr. Hedrick knows, I've met with a lot of y'all in here. It just may not be what you think it's going to look like, your methods, but we're going to get there. And with the hope of protecting those participants. And when we look at outreach and engagement, I mean, really, we should be focusing on the protection of those participants, because if we lose that trust with that population, I mean, just call it quits on your project. You're not going to have that in with them if you mess it up. The other thing is that I always like to tell people, I did not name the exempt, limited, expedited, and full board studies. That was our federal government that gave the names to the review types. So please don't call me and tell me that you're in a hurry and you need an expedited proposal, because it's not going to be fast. But there are 4 different review types. And when Dr. Madison and I sat down, she had, okay, this is my target population. This is the data I'm wanting to collect from it. And so we didn't have one IRB for the entire project, right? So this one piece was going to have this IRB. The one that had 18 consent forms was expedited, but she was even going to have a full board study with it. So when you think about this project, don't think about, I've got to have every single thing in one IRB. We can split it up, and we can also do it in phases. So, okay, this needs assessment. This is what I need first, and I'm going to use that needs assessment for generalizable knowledge. So I want that IRB. So we can get started there, and we can do modifications, or we can do a whole new proposal with it. The one thing that sometimes gets hard in outreach and engagement is maybe not all of it needs an IRB. But like Dr. Madison said, if there's human subjects involved and they're alive, if they're dead, they're not my problem. I don't care. Somebody else's problem.
Yes, we should.
Yeah. So, but you're going in and you're obtaining that information from them. This could be done through surveys, focus groups, and maybe it's actually an intervention, which is a huge part. We're going to go in and do an intervention about nutrition for children and see if they improve, right? Or sometimes it's a school district providing us data on the students. That also is that human subject aspect of it. And there is a systematic investigation, but it's used for generalizable knowledge, meaning you can go in and say, hey, if we do the same study in a different location with a different population, we're going to get the same results. That's hard in outreach and engagement because it usually starts with the needs assessment, right? And a lot of times the needs assessment isn't generalizable knowledge because it's so specific, right, to that one population. But at the same time, if you're going to generalize that information, you need to think about it from the get-go and be ready to have an IRB on file. And so I can remember when we met, y'all had started the needs assessment and you said, are we good? And I said, you're good. But after the needs assessment, you're going to need an IRB because I could go through a needs assessment under an exempt category 4 secondary data. And that's what we did. But if you know from the get-go, just contact me and let's get it from the start. So there are 3 basic principles that we follow when reviewing protocols. I believe that all of these protocols, no matter what type of research you're doing, should probably be followed, right? Not even research. If you would just like to be a good human being, you should probably follow these principles. So the first one is respect for persons. That means that the participants should volunteer to participate in the research and that they can stop at any moment. This gets difficult sometimes in outreach and engagement when we pair it with that justice one of coercion and undue influence. Because a lot of times your community partners are maybe community members that have influence over that population. It's a city council member, it's a religious leader, it's the school principal, whoever it might be, but they're typically held pretty high within that community. So how can you let the community member know, even though you had your mayor requesting to recruit, or asking you to participate in the survey, how do they know that they can tell that person no? And that's where it's very difficult, I think, with outreach and engagement. Respect for privacy, we can do our part, but once again, when you're working with those community partners, you've got to stress the importance to them of just because you know that somebody participated in the research, you can't tell them. And I'm a qualitative researcher. And if I have the people that I have ever interviewed walk up to me, I know exactly who they are. I know their data. Because, I mean, you just know it if you're a qualitative researcher. And it's my job to protect their identity, even if they would ever approach me. And so how can you stress that to your community partners that you're working with? They have to be fully informed about the research. I think this goes back to deception. We're probably not going to allow deception in an outreach and engagement study. But at the same time, you want to fully disclose to them what's going to happen. So real quick, and y'all are going to think I'm silly, but it just makes you start thinking, what are the things that annoy you about your own friends that they do to you? Dr. Hedrick, if you say anything, you're in trouble.
I'm just taking notes.
Okay, good. Dr. Hedrick and I were recruiters at the same time. When he was at Kentucky, I was at Tech and OSU. But what are the things that your friends do that annoy you? Maybe y'all are nicer than me.
Maybe we don't have friends.
Man, y'all are faculty, y'all don't have,
They share information.
they share information, they talk behind your back. They show up late. They don't tell me what I'm really getting myself in. They say, let's go to dinner. And they've got like an alternative motive going on. Maybe I gotta go help them move stuff. But that's what I think about on Fully Informed about the research is that the things that annoy you just in your everyday life, that's what we want to make sure that the participants are aware of, so that they don't ever start the research and then say, I don't want to do this anymore because you didn't tell me about this. And that's when I see people, they're like, I don't have a huge participant dropout. It is because they're not fully informing them about their research. They're not being transparent. So I think that's important. Okay, so beneficence. So maximize the benefits, minimize the risk. And risk can be psychological, physical, social, economic, legal harm, all of that kind of good stuff. We're looking at the normal daily life. So the one thing I will tell you about this is what you may think is a risky situation. You have to look at that population and what is risky for them. Because everybody's normal daily life is different. So it's your past experiences and current situation. I agree 100% with what Dr. Madison says. The risk for us is constantly changing. We have a lot of studies here at Tech that ask about abortion. It was not a concern for us until Roe versus Wade was overturned. And then Texas also created that rule. Now those abortion studies are some of our most risky studies that we have on the campus, and we have to protect them. So know that risk is constantly adjusting. Justice, I think, is probably the other big point when it comes to community partners, is how can we recruit this population? How can we consent them that they don't feel obligated to do the research? I think that's really important. The one other thing I want to add on respect for privacy, and I wrote this on my notes and then I forgot. Were y'all all here with Chancellor Hance? Or some of y'all I know were here with Chancellor Hance. That man had a lot of direct quotes that you didn't even have to see his name and you know it was him saying it. That's sometimes what our community partners are. When you're interviewing these people and they give you a quote or they tell their story, when you're writing up your findings, I think it's important to go back to that participant and say, hey, this is actually what I would like to write about you. This is the quote I would like to use. Because you may protect their identity, but if somebody's reading it, they may be able to identify who that is. So I think if we want that continued strong relationship, it's really important to have these people not just do a member check, but this is actually what I am going to be writing about you in these articles. So Dr. Madison touched a lot of this, but I will tell you from an IRB perspective, when you start doing this, we're going to say, well, how do you know that this is the process, that it works? And that's where we're going to start looking at that cultural, that community background. And if you're asking maybe for something slightly different, we want you to justify it with that background of that community. We're going to need to know the number of participants. I know that is a hard thing to provide in outreach in engagement, but the larger the population, the more likely of a chance of a risk happening, right? It may be a minimal risk, but there's still a risk. The smaller the population, the easier it is to identify somebody. I got a survey yesterday and he said, oh no, this is not identifiable. And I said, if I answered any of these demographic questions, you would exactly know who I am. And that's partly because I come from Crest, Texas, 783 people. If I put down my hometown, you can identify. The other thing is so when you're gonna always seek IRB approval first. If you're working with another institution, let's say you're working with LCU, South Plains, you're going to pick one of us to be the IRB of record, and we're going to do reliance agreements with those institutions. Lubbock ISD has their own research ethics board. So then we're gonna have to go through Lubbock ISD to get their approval as well. But also know that you need approvals to do recruitment at locations, consenting at locations, maybe even data collections. So please, 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 please do not get IRB approval and tell a community partner that you can do whatever you want to because you have IRB approval and that you can recruit in this location. That has happened. So just know that you still have to get those permissions. No regulations, especially if you're dealing with HIPAA or FERPA, but also no mandatory reporting. Because with that Title IX rule that we all have to follow, it's a lot of gray. And right now it's college students, but if you're made aware of something, what we don't know, what if that student's a dual credit student and not at Texas Tech? They're at South Plains College. That law doesn't specifically say Texas Tech students. So know those rules as well. Obviously submit your documents in English as well as the participants' preferred language. And the other thing that I will tell you is that you as the PI are the one sole responsible. If your community partner does something wrong, I'm not going to the community partner. I'm going to be talking to the PI. Know that if something goes wrong ethically, your funding can be taken away. And if that partner has federal funding, that could be taken away from them as well. So it is your job to make sure that they're trained, that they're following the rules, that they understand the Belmont report, everything. But the one thing I will tell you is that you have this approved protocol, use it to your advantage and say, I'm sorry, we can't do it that way. We have to follow this document. You know, use that document to your advantage. If you're having problems and you're like, I need to pull Cassidy in to have a conversation, pull me in. That's what I'm here for. So the other thing, when it does come to training, so if they're helping with recruit, consent, data collection, analysis of identifiable data, they have to have human subject training at this point. And we can come together and figure out how we're going to do that training for them. I do think it's important because this is where you're going to stress, this is how things are done when it comes to this research. The other thing, if it is federally funded, there can only be one IRB of record. So that's a piece to know. And then we will do reliance agreements for everybody else. Okay, helpful links, which are you sending this out, Dr. Madison, or?
Yes.
But just some IRB links, and I'm gonna stop talking because I know that y'all probably have questions.
Can I just clarify with you? So, did you say that the IRB process would start already with a needs assessment? Like sometimes we have stakeholder meetings just to figure out, okay, so what does a certain neighborhood need, or what does a certain organization need?
So needs assessments are hard because technically they are not generalizable knowledge. They're specific to one group. Where that gets difficult is there are other IRBs that interpret that differently and say a needs assessment, you're going to need an IRB. But here at Tech, technically a needs assessment, in my opinion, because I was trained by this woman, is not like a true needs assessment is not generalizable knowledge. The other piece of that, if you wait too long, is like if you're say you do want to publish that needs assessment, some journals now are not going to let you publish without that IRB protocol. So what I would tell you is soon as you're like, we're doing a needs assessment, but you know what, this is turning into a bigger project, you contact me and let's start brainstorming of what that's going to look like going forward. And that's exactly what Dr. Madison did. She said, we're doing a needs assessment. I said, okay, that's all we can do.
So the other thing is that when we had the conversation, our needs assessment was all electronic and it was going to go straight into a database. And so it would actually be more problematic if we did have consent forms, because then we would know who actually participated, which is a problem in a lot of cases. And because if I were to do a needs assessment and go and do a town hall or a focus group or something, that might have been a totally different conversation. Because now I'm directly interacting with individuals. Okay, the needs assessment, you snapped a QR code, it opened up. It had an ability to toggle between Spanish and English. That was an interesting aspect. And went through that, and it just dumped into a very large system. I used the Momentive group to actually help facilitate it. They're the parent group of Survey Monkey. So everything was going through Texas Tech University. And everything was, we could set that survey so that if Brian had it on his device, we set it up so that somebody else could go ahead and close that out and start a new one instead of having a link that goes to it. See, that's another danger. So we talked about these things. And again, it was not we weren't gonna, it's that generalizability aspect to that. It was just for that population to go ahead and figure out what their needs were for that area. We weren't intending it for any other location. We weren't trying to.
And it was
compare
to
two
help you
groups.
write the grant.
Right. And then after that, everything else became really much more difficult.
And that's where I say a true needs assessment, because I get this phone call a lot of, oh, this was a needs assessment, that was program evaluation. I was like, no, it's not. You just didn't want to do an IRB. And so that's where just be aware of like, okay, this is a needs assessment versus I'm trying to get around the IRB. Don't do that, because if you catch me on a bad day, I'm not very helpful.
But I was totally prepared for her to tell me that, yes, we were gonna have to do the IRB, because I started it as soon as the minute that was going on. And then I was sitting there saying, okay, so we're gonna kind of work on the questions that are gonna happen with that, but I'm gonna be working on my protocol, how we're gonna disseminate this, how we're gonna do all of that stuff ahead of time. And again, that's just, part of that is being comfortable with the IRB board, part of that is having done this for a lot of timeframes. But what we're trying to do is kind of give you some hints as into where you might have some problems.
And I will say, has anybody submitted an exempt, I mean, I know some of y'all have submitted an exempt protocol here at Tech. They're so easy.
Yeah.
And a lot of times, like your needs assessment with an anonymous
Could
survey,
be
is it exempt? It's gonna take you 15 minutes to get it submitted, and we're gonna approve it in a day. So,
it's gonna take you longer to figure out the survey questions itself.
right,
than anything
Yeah,
else,
yeah.
how to disseminate it than anything else.
Yeah. so keep that in mind.
So, I have a question about, both of y'all mentioned providing clear understanding potentially in other languages.
Right.
We have struggled with, providing consent forms or like legal documents, even like photo release forms for folks in English and Spanish, because even culturally, it has a very different connotation. What do you mean I want to sign my minor to go into this
Right.
lab? Like in case of death, right? Like that's something we sign, and it's like, it's fine.
Yeah.
You know, they're not gonna die, but like they don't know that, right? And so I have two kind of questions. Is one is culturally, is there a way that we can not adapt those things, but like be more culturally appropriate in those ways? And then the second is, what are the university resources in helping us translate those things? You know, because it's really expensive to continue to pay to have these things.
So I think that's the great thing about a community partner, is that you have somebody on the ground that is familiar with that culture, that
Could
one,
assist.
yeah, can assist. Hopefully they can help you actually translate to what is appropriate. Now, obviously, what I will tell you is, like, when we're doing outreach and engagement here in the United States, obviously we're gonna have regulations that we've got to follow. When we go into another country, not only are we looking at like what's culturally appropriate there, but now we're having to look at their regulations, right? So all great questions, and what I'm gonna tell you is that's where you use your community partner.
So I absolutely agree, community partner. I know that when we were doing our particular grant, we have actually faculty members who we paid to go ahead and do some of the translations with that. Sam Sumner, who's sitting over here, he's been doing some things. We've had some questions about our own survey for our own group. And he's been working with modern languages, for example, to reach out and find individuals. It could be that you may end up having one of those individuals on your team, because it's going to be a rich source for them too, to actually be able to interact with that particular group. So there's other ways to kind of think about those, but you're right. I mean, I would say that you're going to have to be kind of creative with that. And if you need some assistance like that, Sam has recently done that for us and given us a couple of contacts that he could probably point you to. And by the way, there are modern language undergraduate and graduate students that are fairly fluent in a lot of their languages, and they'd love to get a little extra cash if they're permitted to do that. They're not international students themselves and have some limitations with that. But community partners themselves are really, really helpful with that. And I know that when we were actually handing out surveys, some of our survey team was speaking Spanish. You know, I'm sitting there, I'm the white chick. Okay, but the rest of them are sitting there having great conversations, and they might kind of tell me, you know, a little bit about some of the feedback and the concerns with that. That's really important because it became the community alongside us.
Yeah.
Okay, not just us. Community partners were there too.
And that's something like very common, especially in the consent process, that the IRB will ask, like, okay, you're telling me you're gonna be working with all Spanish speakers. Not a great guess, but I'm looking at the research team and I'm not seeing anybody that can speak Spanish. And we will point blank ask, who is consenting?
Right.
Are they qualified to have that conversation back and forth? Because the consent form isn't just, or the consent process isn't just say, read this form. It's a conversation back and forth. And so we will ask those types of questions in the IRB protocol.
I was just going to add something because I think you brought up something very interesting, which is the cultural aspect. So many people think that because it's just translated into Spanish, it'll work for any Hispanic population. And me, having Spanish is my first language, I've been asked to review a lot of consents. And when I see some wording, I'm like, you cannot tell this. So I guess that's the best suggestion, like go to the community partner or find someone who might be like within the Spanish speaking population. South America changes a little bit, a lot from Spain. So maybe someone, I don't mind when it's already translated and I just have to check for accuracy. So I think that's, you can provide kind of like the Google translation, which does a very good job actually
Up to a point.
and then you have someone who really knows kind of those details. And also I wanted to bring something up that you said, Cassidy, about the international differences, because I've had those that, for example, in some countries, even incentives is actually against the regulations there. So it's also good to have some conversations before you're worrying about where am I gonna get the incentives? Well, actually, in that particular context, it might be against.
Yeah. And that's where, like, when we're talking international research, the IRB is, we're having to trust the PI, the research team on some of the procedures, and you can't do an incentive, or actually this minor doesn't have to have permission at this age, you know, so we need that research team to do their homework. Hey, one thing I want to add, and that you touched on it, and I want to say it because it's very, very important. So when we talk about protection of data, one thing to keep in mind is when you're working with these community partners and they are putting data on their personal computer, we cannot access that. So a question I have been asked is, Cassidy, is there any study you have approved that you regret? There's one study I regret. And what happened was it was student work, very, very sensitive data, very sensitive data. He had interviews with audio and the transcription on his personal computer. Because the area that he was within did not provide grad students with a university laptop. He passed away, unfortunately. How do we go in as a university and say, I need that personal computer because I need to pull the data off of it? We can't. So there is a laptop somewhere with very sensitive data floating around. So think about that as you do this community partnership. And I think with y'all's big one, y'all were gonna have equipment
Right.
that was gonna be stored. But anytime somebody puts something personal, we no longer have access to that data.
So that kind of leads into my question, which was on one of the previous slides, you talked about when community partners are helping with data collection or recruitment or what have you, what constitutes helping? And when do you consider their help something that needs the IRB approval?
Yeah. So Dr. Madison and I talk about this a lot. Because so much of like the College of Education studies have a gatekeeper. They have a liaison that's just passing on the information. Those people can't actually tell you the big picture items. And so I would say, one, if they're helping with recruitment and not just forwarding an email, but if they're standing up there and saying, guys, you know, we have partnered with Texas Tech University and we're going to start doing this, and you expect that person to be able to answer questions about it, then I think they're involved in recruitment. If they're at all involved in the consent process, they're involved. If they're doing data collection, I would say they're pretty involved. And even if it's just, here's an iPad, would you like to do a survey, an anonymous survey? To an extent, they're involved, and we just want to, and that's what Dr. Madison and I talked about, is let's do a group training with these individuals so that they know when they hand somebody an iPad that says, do this on a survey, what their expectation is back and forth. And then if a person says, oh man, I don't really like this question, that they, yeah, that you say, well, you can skip it, or you remember, you can stop at any point.
Right.
So.
And I would also say, one of the other things that we did about the needs assessment survey is that we brought in Dr. Carol Sumner from the DEI group. Oh, maybe I shouldn't have said that word. Yeah. But part of that is that we also wanted to not be inflammatory with the statements that we were actually making. We were not having like a negative mindset, you know, deficit mindsets, those types of things. Which it helps to have somebody else looking at that. So please give yourself enough time to have other people take a look at it, to get the translations that you need to have another person have a different perspective. Hopefully to even go to some of your community partners and say, could you take this for us? Are we right that it's going to take us 10 minutes to do this? Are we right that it's going to take us 15 minutes to do this? You can catch a lot of mistakes that way. And again, it's not like they're taking the survey. They're part of the team. They're helping you devise the survey. So it's not a problem that way. Again, that's that transparency that you need to do. I also need to acknowledge that we're a couple minutes over. So if you guys need to leave at this point in time, I really do want to say my appreciation to Dr. Street to come in and help us out with this. Because this is the one thing that as we're gearing up for community engaged research, having this information is very, very helpful to you. And it's incredibly helpful to her to have this give and take and having these questions. It really helps her.
Yes, it does. And I think that's the great thing about the meetings is, yes, everything has to be in the IRB protocol. But if I have a little bit of background and I've got to fill in some gaps with the reviewers, it's very helpful.
Other questions, if you need to leave, please feel like you can get up and go. Yes.
Were there any that shared?
Okay, Tanya.
Well, I just feel kind of like that step from doing outreach where you have a program with the community, everybody's excited about what they're doing, and let's say like the kids benefit, they have a great time, to engage scholarship. It's such a huge hurdle where I personally with the, like, let's say like the teachers and the kids I work with on outreach, I cannot justify asking them to do all that. So I think I'll eventually I'll do outreach for the rest of my career or stop doing it at some point. But it really just, I mean, I come from an engineering background, so it's kind of like, well, working with computers is so much easier, or with electronics or you name it. But kind of like yeah, everybody's doing great and we know we're having a great program. The teachers stay with it for 15 years, 20 years. They come back, they want us to do it. We're facilitating it, whatever they take out of it. The moment I want to write about it,
It becomes
and
very
it
problematic.
becomes very, very problematic. And as long as it's outreach, it's kind of like nobody cares service.
Right.
And they already put like because like I know many of my teachers, and it's a robotics program in elementary school, they spend like an afternoon a week with the students outside of class time for no payment. They come on weekends for no payment, for the better good of, or maybe they have some incentive from, or there is coercion from the principal, but. And then if now I want to know like what's the benefit, who is your population and so forth, it just seems like I'm adding
And this is,
hours and hours and hours of their time in addition where.
and this is where I would say. Go to the community, and if they can see that this is a need that they, you know, that they can contribute to for other people. For example, they might sit there and say, but I have a sister city down here, and how would we get that started? And how can we convince that? And a lot of times what you'll find out is. They need some sort of data. Well, guess what? Now you're collecting data to share it with other individuals. Now you've crossed over, you know, so, but
Well, I
again,
think that, and again, it's kind of like it's that anecdotal evidence. I have
right.
like all these teachers who move away from Presidio, they're all over
Yeah.
Texas. Suddenly you have like a school popping up in Port Arthur, like, how do you hear about us?
right,
Well, I was a teacher at Presidio previously, and they just, all they tell you, it's kind of like, we enjoyed it, we want to keep doing it.
Well.
And it's just kind of like, well, and I'm saying it's kind of like my personal struggle, frustration.
Right.
I know I'm not doing good and
What I
I,
think you could do is partner with a faculty member out of the College of Ed